So the other cool thing is that this also works if we're returning an object with methods. So the same rules apply, because see, look, we have these functions that are still inside this parent scope, even though we're actually returning it in an object. So let's explore what that looks like. Well, I'll type it out here and then I'll paste it. So we're going to call, so here's like a counter, we're going to call counter. Okay, so where did we leave off? Actually, I think Phil, you were the last one, right, last time? So we should start at the beginning. I guess that'll be you, Rich.
Okay, so it's like a global function, I guess, called counter.
Mm-hmm.
Makes space to initialize it, and then it finds that, and it goes down to the,
Yep.
skips the whole body.
So we said, great, there's a counter, we skip it. And then Grace?
We assigned my counter the return value of counter function.
Sure. So we called counter, and then it goes into the counter body. And then Joe?
Sets the local variable n to 0.
Mm-hmm.
And then my counter is equal to the return value. So you return that.
What is this?
An object of two functions.
Yeah. So this is an object literal. It has two properties on it. One is count and one is reset. And they're both functions, so you could call them a method. It might not look like an object in this form, but if we delete this, you can see that it's just an object with our properties in there. So we're returning an object. Great. So what is my counter now, Kim?
Object count colon the function.
Totally. And then if we wanted to increment the counter, how would we do that, William? Knowing that my counter is an object. Actually, let's inspect it before we jump ahead. So we have my counter is an object with two properties. So if we wanted to count, we wanted our counter to count, how do we access the counter property?
Dot.
Yeah, we could use a dot. Dot what?
Dot count.
Dot count, like this?
Friends.
Oh, so if we don't call it, right, it's just going to be the name. So we need to invoke our function, and it's going to increment it. So there's one, and then we can keep doing it, right, and it's going to keep counting. So we can see my counter, still just an object, we haven't affected it, anything. And then if we wanted to reset it, could we do this? Yep, that will also work. You can use bracket notation. And so count like that. So as we see, we can return the functions from inside of an object as well. And this in is still holding access to its parent scope in its previous environment. So if we wanted to call it, again, oops, it's my counter dot count, and we have to call that since it's a function. It's going to be 1. So maybe 2, etc. Cool? Thumbs?
Well, the only difference between this and the previous example is that we're using the dot notation to access a function in an object
Yeah.
that's being returned from the...
Right. So the main difference is that for this one, we're just returning one function. And the next one, we're returning an object that contains two functions. So if you wanted to do different things like reset the counter, you're going to need two different functions, right? So this is how you would do that. And here's just like a recipe, sort of outlining sort of the ideas of like, how do we create a closure? So the first thing is you have to create the parent function. So here we have the function checkScope, and it's a picture so I can't highlight it. It goes here. Then we define some variables in the parent's local scope up here, this inner var. And then you put a function inside of it. So the function, again, could be inside an object as well, but it has to be a function. And then you return that function without calling it from the parent function. Right, so that's how you create the closure, or you start to get there. And then if you execute, this is how you would execute it. So here's our checkScope, right? We create a variable, and we store that return function from checkScope. So we call checkScope here. It goes inside the bracket. We create a local variable. And then we see, oh great, there's an inner func. We skip the inner func, and then we return it here. So we return this inner func. So test is now inner func, which will then just return scope. And then if you just check test, you make sure it's a function. This is optional. And then you run test, and test will return if it's local scope or global scope. And of course we know, since we're all experts at scope now, that it's going to return local scope. Cool? So that's just like a recipe and a way to execute for when you're doing the exercises. You can refer back to these slides to sort of get like a step-by-step. Cool. So
there's a slide called Gotcha.
it's not that bad. It's not that bad. So we have this say Alice function, and we're going to call it, and let's just see what it says. So let's start with, who did we leave off? Kevin, did you go last time? Okay, so we'll start with Kevin.
So define a function called say Alice.
Yep, so we define a function called say Alice. And then Ben?
Skips to the lines.
You know, this class has been the most picked up, the skipping the function body, faster than any other class I've ever taught. Good job, guys.
From Minnesota.
Yeah, it's Minnesota. That's what it is.
Well, the online students too. You can't.
Yeah,
You gotta give them
and
credit, too.
the world. Maybe I just got better at really emphasizing that. I don't know. So we skip it, and then Jake.
So we, guess we start at the bottom, and it's variable what? Say Alice.
So we call say Alice, and then Tanner.
We go into our say Alice function.
Yeah, we go into the function body, and then Phil.
So the first thing you do is you skip the make log,
Well, we recognize that there's a make log.
right?
We store it, and then we skip it.
And then you assign that text to Alice.
And then John. So we are here.
So I return the inner function make log back to the column.
So it's returning this function. So what is now a function? And then if we call, oh, I know, it's just, what does she say? That's what we should call it. What does she say? Oops. So what is it gonna, so what is it going to console.log?
Undefined.
That's what Good guess. It's actually gonna console log, why hello there, Alice. And the reason is because if you notice when we walk through this code line by line, we initialize this variable Alice, and it exists. By the time that we call it down here, Alice has already been created and assigned a value.
So it doesn't matter. So it's still, because it's still a parent to makelog. So makelog has Alice available, whether it's done above or below.
Right. Unless like you did,
Right. Then
if you
that's a
move this
different
up
story.
here,
Right.
then it wouldn't work. Or something. Yep.
I have a more fundamental question.
Sure.
On the very first line where you say var, say Alice equal function, could you rewrite that to say function space, say Alice in parentheses?
Yes, you could.
That would be the same thing?
Basically, yes. The cool thing about this, the cool thing about the fact that we can save a function in a variable like this shows us that in JavaScript, our function is just data. So that's kind of cool. And that's why we can return functions from functions like makelog, is because of that.
So if on the second line, makelog, if you wrote that, function space makelog parentheses, if you wrote it that way, you could still return makelog?
Yeah, you can return it anyway. So one is having, so this is an anonymous function stored in a variable. If we had makelog like this, function makelog, this is called a named function.
But
So this
they
is good.
work in this case the same way?
Yeah, it would work the same way. And you
And so why would
can
you
you can
use
even
one
do
over the
two
other?
different ones. Why would you use one over the
Is it
other?
a matter of personal preference or?
It's mostly, so it has a lot to do with scope, actually, is where at what point in your code can you call the function. If you store it in a variable like makelog, then you can't call the function until this line has been called in that scope. But if you had it the other way, we could call makelog up here. Something called hoisting, which happens to all variables, but when you name a function, it doesn't hoist the initialization of it, it hoists the entire definition, so you could call it. And the reason it's a little bit dangerous to do it this way is because if you have like an if-else statement with two functions of the same name, and the hoisting will override it in ways that aren't expected. So in general, I recommend just to call it, to store in a variable like this. Yeah. Cool.
So I think I was confused about the value of Alice because we're defining Alice after makelog, but because it's still in the parent scope, that console log has access to the variable.
Because we actually initialized this and gave it a value before we actually called makelog.
Is that because of hoisting as well? It hoists it to the top of the function, say Alice function.
Yeah, that's part of it, but the fact that it has a value is because of the order in which it's called. Yeah. So here's a stopwatch example. So let's see. So make stopwatch is called here. So we enter into this block of code, and it's going to console.log initialized, and we're going to set elapsed as 0, and then we're going to console log elapsed just to see what it is. And you'll notice too that these two console logs will only be run once every time you call make stopwatch. So even if we called X down here, these two console logs won't run because we're not ever going back up here. We're just going to go immediately inside of this function. So then we have the stopwatch function, which all it will do is console log stopwatch and return elapsed. But we're going to skip over it because we haven't even called it. Then we have this increase function, which is on a set interval. And so like set interval, like set timeout that we saw earlier, set interval will just, it's not a blocking operation. It will just call increase every 1 second, basically forever. So we'll just keep calling increase. So this is our stopwatch. It will keep the time. And then we return stopwatch. And again, stopwatch is this function that's just going to return elapsed. So let's investigate. So let's investigate what happens. Let's pop this out, make it, see if I can make it bigger. No. It's not making it. Oh, there we go. So I'm just putting that code in there, and then we can say var watch equals make stopwatch, and we're going to call it. And so we see that initialize and 0 are called. If we have other watch, we can do make stopwatch again. Whoops. Make stopwatch again. And we see that those two console logs happen, the very beginning here, again. However, when we call watch, initialize and 0 aren't running. And that shows us that this code up here is only run once. So that scope is created once. And then when we call this down here, the body in here will be run again. So we have watch. And then we have other watch, 38, etc. Does that make sense? So that's just another example of how you can use closure. So the first one was write a function called nonsense that takes an input string. This function contains another function, blab, which alerts that string and is immediately called inside the function nonsense. And here's an example of what blab should look like. It's just a function. It alerts string. And so we have our function nonsense here. I called the parameter string. And then if we were going to call nonsense, we could say nonsense. And we can, oh, actually I already did it down there. So we can call nonsense down here with blah, blah, blah. So string is now this blah, blah, blah. And then we enter through the function body here. We see that there's another function. We skip it. We call blab. And blab then alerts what? Yeah, blah, blah, blah. Exactly. So for the second one, we're doing something a little bit different. Instead of immediately calling blab, we're calling it after 2 seconds. So we're set timeout, and then it will still alert blab. So for the third one, instead of calling it inside or doing a set timeout, we're just going to return the function body. So we see here on line 34 that we return blab, which is going to return the function body. So blab later is actually going to be the function body here, and it's going to alert when we call it. So if we call blab later here, it's going to what? What is it going to alert? Kevin, do you know?
Blah, blah, blah.
Yeah, exactly. So it's going to alert blah, blah, blah. And then blab again later. We called it. What's that going to return, Tanner?
It's going to return blah, blah, blah.
Close. It's actually going to return he. Because we called nonsense with he. So string, in this case, is going to be he. Can you guys see that in the back? Cool. What if we did blab later here? What's that gonna alert? John?
Could you repeat the question, please?
Sure. Oh, I'm sorry, I didn't realize you were on your phone. If we called blab again later right here, what is that gonna return? What is this gonna alert?
Blah, blah, blah.
Yep, so it's still gonna alert blah, blah, blah. So the fact that blab again later is alerting he doesn't affect the blah, blah, blah. If that makes any sense. And why is that? Why are they two separate things? Grace, do you remember? Oh, Tanner remembers. Why, Tanner?
I just want redemption because you're passing in the variables after nonsense.
Yeah, absolutely. And every time we call that function, the inner function is creating a new scope. Even though they both are sharing the same parent scope, it's new. It's a new inner scope here for this function. Cool. Dun, dun, dun. So this is a function called last name trier. You pass it your first name and it creates this complicated algorithm that you can try on last names like little girls do when they have a crush. You know, if you have lots of crushes, you can see which one sounds better with your name. So how it works is you pass in your first name. So if your first name is Farmer, you would pass Farmer. And then you could try on the last name Brown, and that's going to log Farmer Brown. And it's also really convenient if like you really, really like someone and if you want to just write their name all over everything, you can just like do this a bunch of times, you know? I don't think boys do this, but girls, they write their crushes' names a lot. No? No? No one? Okay. Just me? All right, fine.
Do you use those gel pens?
What? Yeah, with gel pens. Absolutely. You got to be careful because they smear, you know? There's an art to it. Okay. Anyway, too much information. So here, if you want to try on different farmer names, so Farmer Jane, Farmer Lynn, for example.
Well, that's for the farmer to find out if he's going to marry a Jane or a Lynn.
Yeah?
So guys could use this function. So.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a gender neutral.
Right. Or it could be a female farmer too.
Yeah.
Who's going to marry a farmer like Jane or Lynn.
Or if you're giving birth and you know that your prodigy is going to be a farmer, you can match that. So it's it's
very unisex, yeah.
Yeah. Cool. Anyway, so here we have our function. So our parent function is here, and then we have an inner function here. And again, we're returning that inner. So how we'd run this is we'd say, oh, and I forgot to mention, Katrina these are Katrina's solutions, so she's awesome. Look her up, add her on Twitter, all those things. So Katrina, so var first name Katrina, pass the string Katrina, and then to last name trier. So the string Katrina is now first name. We have this inner function, we skip it, and we return it. So first name Katrina now is the value of this inner function. So now when we call first name Katrina, we can pass her last name, which I'm not going to try to pronounce. Chaco. I guess I tried it. So Chaco is last name, and then we're just going to console.log the first name plus the last name. The cool thing here is that this parameter stays the same, Katrina. We don't actually have to say var first name like this. Oops, equals first name or anything like that. It just holds reference to the parameters because they also live in the scope. So we can just do it like that. And then you can also, you know, try it with Smith as well. Any questions on that?
It says like you can do like Fibonacci series with these because you're storing the results of the next.
Yeah.
things like that.
Yeah, you could do a lot of different things with it. I think there's one thing. Oh, there's one thing I wanted to mention for this nonsense function. A common mistake that I see is that when you are writing the inner function, you will also give it a parameter name of the same name from the parent function. And that's not going to work because if you don't pass anything to blab, so when we're calling blab here with no arguments, that means string is now undefined, and the most local variable value is the one that wins. So this alert here is going to then alert undefined because it's being overwritten by this parameter name. So if you're seeing that problem, just double check your inner function's parameter and make sure that that function is actually taking an argument. If it's not, then it's going to be undefined. Cool. So we have last name trier, and then we have the story writer. So this is a function that returns an object with two methods. One method is add words, which will add words to your function, and the other one is erase. So you might imagine that this is like that game that people play where you start off with a story, you start off with like a beginning of a sentence, and then you give it, the next person adds a sentence, and then you go on and on. You create a big story. Has anyone played that like on road trips before? Not in Minnesota? Okay, some of you have. Okay. So we have just an example of how we use it. We have this variable farm love story, and we have story writer, which is a function that we call. Then farm love story is now going to be an object that has the property add words, which you can then pass a string. And so this string is there was once a lonely cow. And then that will just return there was once a lonely cow, and then you can add more words, and then it will concatenate that string. It'll say there was once a lonely cow, it saw a friendly face, because we just added this there. And then another example would be like story of my life, which is my code broke, and then I ate some ice cream. It's pretty consistent, my day-to-day. And then you can erase it. So that's how you would implement, that'd be the functionality of the story writer function. And so this is what it looks like on the inside. So in our closure scope, we have our story, which just starts off empty, right? And then we return this object, and this object has two properties. The first one's add words, which is a method, and this method takes a string. And story is you add the string, and then I put a space in between, and then I return the story.trim. And what that does is it just it doesn't show, it deletes the last, the trailing space, so that it wouldn't look, so it doesn't print like I ate some ice cream and then space. It doesn't actually trim it off, it just shows a copy of the string without the last space. So the space actually still exists in story. And the erase function is pretty simple. You just set story back to an empty string. Cool. Any questions about that?
I wasn't getting, so when you run that, where do you see that on the, it'll actually print that out on the console? Because
yeah, that's a good point.
I wasn't getting mine print out.
In the console?
Well, not in the console, in the,
What do you mean? Like this one?
It builds it correctly, but it doesn't output to the console like your examples show us it should.
Are you returning? Are you saying my example isn't?
no, mine isn't.
Okay,
I
you make sure
return
that you're
story.
returning.
I don't trim, but I just return story.
Mine doesn't either.
Since it's it's not being executed from the council, it's not gonna dump it out there unless you actually have a council log statement. If you execute the call from a council statement, because that's the return value, then it would show it. So when
Right.
you're refreshing your page, it doesn't
Are
necessarily.
you doing it in JSBin?
I was not. We were,
Oh,
a lot of
okay.
us were using the streams.js file from yesterday.
Okay. Yeah, you can just run it directly in your console like this, and it should print out.
It's doing it now.